Hi, my name is Cheryl Pula, and today we're going to be talking about the history and sinking of the RMS Titanic. We're going to start in 1907, a little before the events that we're going to be talking about, with a guy named Lord Pirrie. He's at a dinner party in London, England one night, and Lord Pirrie is on the board of directors of Harland and Wolff. Harland and Wolff was one of the, if not the, best shipbuilding company in the world at the time, and they were located in Belfast, Ireland. Well, he's at this dinner party and he meets a friend of his, J. Bruce Ismay, who's the owner and managing director of the White Star Line. The White Star Line owns a fleet of passenger liners. Now remember, this is the early 1900s, so at the time we didn't have jets that could go across the ocean and back. The Wright brothers had only made the first heavier-than-air flight a few years before. So if you wanted to go from the continent to the North America or vice versa, you had to go by ship. So Ismay and Pirrie are at this soiree and they get talking. And they decide that they want to build together a fleet of 3 big ships that were going to be bigger and better than everybody else. And they were going to be owned by the White Star Line. Now everybody thinks that the Titanic was a British ship, right? Not necessarily technically true. The White Star Line, owned by Ismay, was in fact owned by an American conglomerate owned by the billionaire, if you will, J. Pierpont Morgan. He owned a thing called the International Mercantile Marine Corporation, and they in turn owned the White Star Line, which was based in Liverpool, England. So even though Titanic was technically an American ship, she was flagged British because her home port was in England, in Liverpool. And that's why she's always considered a British ship, why she had a British crew. So the 2 of them decide that they're going to build these ships. There's going to be 3 of them. And they're going to be sister ships built by Harland and Wolff under the auspices of Thomas Andrews, who was the managing director. Now it also helped that Thomas Andrews was Lord Pirrie's nephew, so it was kind of like a family thing. And it was going to be Andrews' job, along with a guy named Alexander Carlisle, to draw up the plans for these 3 big ships. Now Carlisle was only on the job a little while because he and Andrews had a difference of opinion of how these ships should be constructed and what they should have on them. So Carlisle quit the project and that left it up to Andrews to carry it out. Now the 3 ships they were going to build were going to be called the Olympic, the Gigantic, and the Britannic. But somewhere along the line they thought that Gigantic was too grandiose of a name, so they renamed the second ship the Titanic. And that's the one we're going to be talking about. Now the original plans for the ship called for it to have 3 smokestacks, but they put a 4th one on to make it look more aesthetically pleasing, to have an even number of smokestacks, and to make the ship look even bigger than it was going to be. They didn't really have to do that because the Titanic, when she was launched, would be the largest ship ever launched by mankind. She was going to be 882.5 feet long. So she didn't really need anything to make her look bigger than she was, but they did it anyway. So they laid the keel at Harland and Wolff and began construction. And when you went to Belfast, the ships were so big that they had to build a gantry, which is the little like iron framework of steel girders that they used to build the ships in, were the tallest things in town. So visitors said when they went to Belfast, they could see the ships and the gantryways before they could see the town. The Olympic was going to be the first of the 3 ships built, and she would actually be launched a year or so before the Titanic would be launched. But the 2 of them were being built at the same time. The Olympic begun first, and the Titanic second. And then when they were in the gantryways, of course, they would put on the paint and all this other stuff to the exterior of the ship, including a little band of like reddish paint on the bottom of the ship. And that was called anti-fouling paint. That was there to keep like barnacles and other little sea creatures from attaching to the ship, which would slow it down. Now while the ships were being built, all the stuff that was going to go on the ships was also being built. They were going to have 3 anchors aboard the Titanic, each one weighing about 15 tons each. And it took a horse team of about 10 or 12 horses to pull it from the foundry down to the docks to be put on the ship. They also fabricated the smokestacks. There were going to be 4. There were also going to be 25 boilers aboard the ship. The boilers is where they burn the coal to generate the steam which would move the ship forward. She was going to have both turbine and reciprocating engines aboard. Most people think she was all turbine, but she wasn't. It took almost 2 years to build the ship. She was going to be launched on May 31st, which was a Wednesday, May 31st, 1911, at about noon at Harland and Wolff. And what they did was they built the hull of the ship first. They didn't put on the smokestacks, they didn't put on the masts or anything like that. If they did that, they would stick up above the girders in the gantry-way, and they wouldn't have been able to launch the ship because those things would have torn off the ship, or they would have precluded the ship from being launched. So they launched the ship, basically just an empty hull, and it only took 61 seconds to launch the Titanic, 1 minute and 1 second. And if you see movies about the Titanic, they show them, breaking champagne bottles over the bow and all that. They didn't do that. Harland and Wolff didn't believe in all that kind of ceremony, so they just basically shoved the ship back into the water, and she was taking over to what was called a graving or a finishing dock, and that's where they put on the smokestacks, the masts, the wires for the radio, all these stuff that was going to go on the inside of the ship for the passenger cabins, like the beds, the carpeting, the paneling, all this kind of stuff. Once they had the ship done, she was required by law to go out and have what were called sea trials to make sure that she was seaworthy. Normally what they would do is they would take a ship out and they would sail it around for a couple days, make sure that it didn't sink, have any leaks or anything like this, and then she would get her certificate and become RMS. Now RMS meant Royal Mail Steamer, and only the best ships plying between the continent and North America carrying the mail were allowed to do this. So the Olympic and the Titanic were both RMS Olympic, RMS Titanic, meaning they were some of the best ships. Unfortunately, the day they were supposed to go out for their sea trials, the weather was bad. So they took the Titanic out, sailed her around for 2 or 3 hours, brought her back in, said she's seaworthy and you can start operations. To promote their new ship, White Star took out some ads. They did a promotional poster showing the ship. They took out some ads in magazines showing cutaways of the deck. It said largest steamers in the world, the White Star Line. Now that was their selling point. They had a rival line called the Cunard Line, which is still in business today. And Cunard sold their ships because they made the fastest crossings of the Atlantic. The White Star knew they couldn't compete with speed, so they went for luxury. So what they did was they took this cutaway diagram of the ship and made little descriptions of what was on each deck to try and entice people to come and sail on their ships because they were so luxurious. They also issued a postcard showing a painting of the Olympic, her sister ship, up on her stern end, next to a rendering of the Woolworth Building in New York City, which at the time was the tallest building in the world at 775 feet. The Olympic was 882 feet long, so they showed this on their postcard that their ship was longer than the tallest building in the world was tall. The Venolia Toilet Soap Company used the Titanic on one of their ads to promote the fact that their soap was going to be what was used on this brand new beautiful ship that was going to carry people across the Atlantic. She also boasted a lot of safety features. She had a double hull, which meant if something happened to the outside of the hull, there was another one on the inside so the water wouldn't get into the ship. They had electronic gravity-assisted watertight doors. That meant that if you were up on the bridge and there was a leak or water coming into the ship somewhere, you could push a button up on the bridge where the captain and the crew ran the ship from, and the watertight doors would automatically drop into place to shut off the water. Now what happens if the water goes out, the power goes out? Not a problem. You could also lower them by hand, and they were gravity assisted, so once they started to drop, they would just drop into place. They were unlike any other watertight doors on other ships because most of them had to swing from side to side. This way they just dropped down, so it didn't matter how the force of the water. It would just close the ship off. They also had all watertight compartments in the bottom of the ship, and the latest in communication technology. That meaning they had a Marconi wireless machine aboard the ship, which most ships did not have. They also had what were called Welland quadrant davits on their lifeboats, which was the latest in lifeboat technology to raise and lower the boats. They also had to employ radio operators from the Marconi company to run the wireless, because they were the only ones who knew how to do it. The ship is set to sail on April 10th, 1912. It was a Wednesday. And it was going to take about 5 or 6 days for the ship to go from Southampton, England, to New York, which was going to be her final port. Titanic was so big that there were only 2 ports in the world where you could, if you were a passenger, get onto the ship directly from the shore onto the ship. And that was Southampton, England, and New York, New York. If you got on the ship anywhere else, like in Cherbourg, France, or Queenstown, Ireland, you had to go out to the Titanic or the Olympic on a ferry boat. And White Star built a series of these ferry boats, and that way you'd load your luggage onto the boat, you go out to the boat, and you get onto the Titanic. One of these little ferry boats is still around. Its name is Nomadic, and it doesn't serve as a ferry boat anymore, but if you go to Paris, France, she's now a floating restaurant in the Seine River. Now the Titanic had the best crew the White Star had to offer. The captain was Captain E.J. Smith, and he had very experienced officers with him, one of whom was Hugh McElroy, who was the purser. Now the purser would be like the equivalent of a hotel manager on shore. He would see to all the passengers' wants and needs. So the day comes and the Titanic is going to sail, April 10th. She pulls away from the dock, large crowds on the dock to watch her go. And as she's going through what's called the Solent, which is a strip of water that connects the harbor at Southampton to the English Channel, she almost meets a disaster, because there are some ships tied up at the dock along with her. Now at the time, there was not enough coal in Southampton to assure the Titanic could get all the way across the ocean without refueling, which you would have to do, because there was nowhere else to do it. So what they did was they took coal from the other ships in the harbor and put it on board the Titanic. They also had to take the passengers from those ships off of those ships and put them on the Titanic, because when she sailed, she was less than half full. By the time they transferred these other passengers over, she was taking about 1,500 passengers, maybe 2,000, a little over 2,000 passengers, and crew aboard, which still wasn't in capacity because she could hold 3,000. She took a little over 2,000, 2,500 maybe or so, 2,200. But anyway, she's going through the Solent, this little strip of water, to get to the English Channel, when the suction of her passing through the water was so great, it began to pull these other ships towards the side of the Titanic. But they were tied up at the dock, so that wasn't a problem, except for one ship, the New York, a small ocean liner. The pressure on the hawsers, or the 9-inch thick lines that held her to the dock, snapped because of the pressure and began to pull the New York towards the side of the Titanic. Well, there was a little tugboat out there called the Vulcan, which saw what was going on, and her crew got their tugboat out there in time to stop the New York from hitting the side of the Titanic. They missed by 5 feet. If she had hit Titanic, the Titanic would have had to go out, come back, take everything off, check for damage, then sail again. But since they missed each other, Titanic kept going and cleared the harbor about noon on April 10th. Now her first port of call was 6 o'clock that evening in Cherbourg, France. She anchored in the harbor, passengers disembarked, new ones came on board, and she was there until after midnight. So from April 10th to after midnight on the 11th, she was in France. Now while she was there, someone took a picture of the Titanic, and it shows her in the harbor with all the smokestacks, the smoke coming out of the smokestacks, all of the lights aboard the ship lit. After the picture was developed, people said, "What's wrong with this picture?" Well, there's two things. One, if it was after midnight, all the lights on the ship would not have been on. One, because there weren't full capacity of passengers. And two, after 11 o'clock at night, they would extinguish all the exterior lights of the ship and put on red lights, because if you had on white lights, it would mess up the night vision of the crew on the bridge who was trying to steer the ship, right? And secondly, they had smoke coming out of all four smokestacks. The fourth one that they put on just for show that I told you about did not work. It was fake. So there wouldn't have been any smoke coming out of that stack. So what we know about the picture is that it was enhanced, if you will, after it was developed. The person who took the picture didn't think it was dramatic enough, so they colored in all the lights and colored in the smoke on the fourth smokestack. So the next morning, Titanic leaves Cherbourg, France for Queenstown, Ireland, which is now known as Cobh, Ireland, where she again takes on passengers, disembarks passengers, and then sets sail for her next port, New York. After she sailed, someone took a picture of her off of what was called the Old Head of Kinsale, the last piece of land they would see in Ireland. Now what makes this photo interesting is that where the Titanic is located in the photograph is just about the same place 3 years later, where the Lusitania would be torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine in World War I. So how could anybody tell when they were looking at it what a White Star ship was? Well, if you heard the name, you knew it was a White Star ship if all the names ended in IC, like Olympic, Titanic, Britannic, Baltic, Oceanic, and so on. They had distinctive buff and black color smokestacks. So if you saw the ship but you couldn't see the name, you could tell by the color of the smokestacks what ship it was. You can do the same thing if you go up to the St. Lawrence Seaway, and you can look at the smokestacks on the ships up there. Now there were three classes aboard. First class, if you paid $2,000 to $4,000, you could go first class. And that was like the Odell family of Philadelphia, John Jacob Astor and his wife Madeline, Benjamin Guggenheim, the Countess of Roths, Margaret Tobin Brown. Anybody who had a lot of money could go first class. First class had a boat deck that they could walk on, and it was not intended to be a boat deck. It was called the boat deck because originally there were supposed to be 42 lifeboats aboard the Titanic. To save money, White Star decided to cut that back to 16 lifeboats. She sailed with, like I said, about 2,500 people aboard, had a maximum capacity of 3,000, with lifeboat capacity for only 1,500. The Board of Trade, the British Board of Trade that governed the safety of these ships, said that for a ship of 10,000 tons or over, which Titanic was, she was over 40,000 tons, all you needed was 16 lifeboats, and that was it. Because there was more room on the boat deck, the first class passengers could roam around and use it more as a promenade deck, an outdoor promenade, and get some air and do this kind of thing. There was a little boy named Doug Spedden, and there's this famous picture of him spinning a top on the deck. And if you saw the movie Titanic with Leonardo DiCaprio, there's a scene where he goes up on deck and steals an overcoat off of a deck chair so that he can go see his girlfriend. Well, if you see that picture of Dougie on the deck spinning his top with three men watching him, in the background is a deck chair with an overcoat. And that's where they got that idea from. That overcoat belonged to a guy named A.L. Ryerson, who was a businessman from Cooperstown, New York. And he was aboard the ship when it sailed. And he's notable because the land, like the National Baseball Hall of Fame that in Cooperstown is on, once belonged to him. If you were first class, you also had an enclosed promenade deck where you could walk. Now, people who had taken the Olympic complained that because the promenade deck was open, it was too cold in April to walk on the deck in the North Atlantic. So they heard about this and they enclosed the one on the Titanic, but it was only in first class, not in second or third. First also had a gymnasium where you could row on the rowing machine or you could pedal on a stationary bike. And you'll note in the picture that the lady has her gloves and her hat and her long skirt on, and she's pedaling on a stationary bike. Because if you were a lady at the time, you did not go out in public unless you looked like that. They also had a Turkish bath and the grand staircase, which led from your quarters down to the dining room and the lounge and all these good places. If you've ever been in the Stanley Theater in Utica, New York, there's a copy of this grand staircase in the Stanley. They also had a lounge, which was very nice, where you could go and you could play cards or do whatever you wanted. There was a smoking room, but this was men only, because in 1912, the time we're talking about now, it was illegal for women to be seen smoking in public. So again, if you saw Titanic and you see Rose light up her cigarette, it never would have happened. Of course, first class also had its posh dining room, where you could go at dinner. Of course, you had to dress for dinner, the ladies with their gowns and their gloves and all that, the men with their tuxedos. They also had what was called the Café Parisien, where you could go for lunch, and you didn't really have to dress to go there. And again, if you saw the movie, there's a scene where they're eating lunch in the cafe. That's where Rose lights up her cigarette. But the Café Parisien was where you could go maybe for lunch, so you didn't have to be so formal. And of course, you had tons of food to choose from. You had like 4 or 5 different appetizers, a cheese course, a beef, a fowl, and a seafood course, salads, whatever you could have. The cabins were very nice. Cabin B59 was the one that belonged to J. Bruce Ismay, who owned the boat, and it had a canopy bed in it, brocade on the walls, fancy paneling. It even had its own section of enclosed promenade deck, so if he was entertaining, they had somewhere to go. Second class. If you paid from about $200 to $400, you could go second class. The cabins were not as opulent, obviously, but they were okay. They were livable. You usually had like 1 bed and maybe 2 bunk beds in it. They also had a lounge and a dining room which had a piano in it so that you could have entertainment. They also had their promenade, but it was open to the elements. Evidently, they didn't pay enough to get a enclosed promenade deck. If you were third class, you could pay anywhere from like $15 to $30 to go third class. Now, when I do this program in schools, the kids always say, "Wow, that's cheap." But remember, this is 1912. These were people who were coming from other countries, immigrants, to come over here to start a better life. At the time that this happened, in April 1912, there were textile worker strikes in the village that I'm from, in New York Mills, outside of Utica. And the average worker made $14 a month. And my grandparents were working in them for $14 a month. So when you're talking $15 to $30 a month, that was a lot of money, especially if you were bringing over a family, like a father and a wife, and maybe 2 or 3 kids. That was a lot of money. They also had a lounge, not very opulent, but it was someplace to go to socialize, and their dining room. And the third class bill of fare, as they call it, the menu for dinner, was probably the best food these people had ever had in their lives. A lot of them, of those who did survive the sinking, said how they had never seen food like this, that it was more than they had ever hoped for. They also had their own promenade deck, which was in the rear section or the aft section of the ship near the flagpole at the stern of the ship. Which brings us to Sunday morning, April 14th, 1912. All has gone well for the first 4.5 days of the trip. And about 9:30 in the evening, the Titanic begins to get Marconi wireless messages from ships to the west, or ahead of them in the direction that they're traveling, telling them that there is ice in the water. About one of the first ones they get is from a ship called the Coronia, and she says, westbound streamers report bergs and growlers, those are icebergs, and field ice, and then they give the latitude and longitude, and then they signed it to, let the captain know there's ice out there. So what did Captain Smith do? Well, he altered course a little further south, figuring he would go around it. He did not slow down, he kept going. Meanwhile, his Marconi wireless operators down in the radio room are in contact with Cape Race, which is in Newfoundland, Canada. And Cape Race is the first radio or wireless station they can contact on their way to the United States once they get out of, British waters. So they're in contact with Cape Race, and they're sending personal messages like John Jacob Astor wants his personal railroad car to meet him in New York City, things like this. So they're about 240 miles or so southeast of Cape Race, and listening to them is a guy named Cyril Evans, who's a radio operator aboard another ship called the Californian. The Californian is owned by the Leland Line, and they are one of the ships that's stopped out there in the Atlantic because there is this ice. They get amid this ice field and they decide it's not prudent to keep going, that they're going to wait until it's light out, because now it's like 11:30 at night, and they're going to wait and figure out what to do. So Cyril gets on his radio and starts tapping out messages to ships within range, saying, this is where we are, and we're on an ice field, and they send the location. So what's happening is the Titanic is heading in their direction, coming straight for this ice field. And they get into it just a few minutes later. And of course it's dark, they can't see. Up in the crow's nest, or where the lookouts are, on the foremast of the Titanic are two crew members whose job it is to look out and make sure there's nothing out there they're going to hit. Well, their name is Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. They have a problem. Well, they have several problems. There's no moon, and icebergs are white. And they rely on the moon's reflection to reflect off the white icebergs so they can see them. There's no moon, so it's pitch dark. It's flat calm. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who would be the senior surviving officer of the Titanic, would say it looked like a mill pond or a mirror. The lookouts look for the waves smashing, onto the side of an iceberg to let them know it's there. There are no waves. It's flat, dead calm. The air temperature is about 28 degrees, which means the water temperature is probably in the 30s, but air temperature is 28 degrees. Titanic is clipping along at about 21 or 22 knots. These two gentlemen are up there above the deck, many feet, with this wind blowing in their faces. If you're driving your car and it's 28 degrees out, you roll down the window and stick your head out, what's going to happen? Your face is going to get really cold, go numb and freeze. Well, that's what's happening to them. So their eyes are watering, they can't see, there's no moon, there's flat calm, they got a problem. And, to top it off, they don't have any binoculars, which makes no sense for two lookouts, right? Well, why don't they have any binoculars? Well, prior to her sailing, a gentleman named David Blair, who was in charge of making sure there were binoculars up there, he was one of the lookouts, was transferred to another ship. He forgot to give the lookouts the key to the box that the binoculars were kept in. So he's got the key, they're out at sea with no way to get these binoculars. So they're up there about 11:30 or so, and they're kind of squinting, and they think they see this big black object up there, but they can't really tell until they get about a mile, 3/4 of a mile away, and then they realize it's an iceberg. So they get on the phone, attaching them to the bridge, and they ring up the bridge and say, "Iceberg, dead ahead." On duty on the bridge is First Officer William Murdoch. What does he do? In hindsight, we know what he should have done was ram the iceberg. The Titanic was built so that she could hit something head-on, flood 3 compartments of the ship, and still stay afloat. What he does is what I think everybody would automatically do as a human reflex. He orders the ship hard over, in other words, turn to the port side, and he puts it in reverse, figuring, that he can maybe miss the iceberg by trying to go around it. Unfortunately, Titanic is a big ship, and she's going pretty fast, and by the time she starts to turn, it's too late. And they just hit a glancing blow against the iceberg. Everybody knows that the largest part of the iceberg is underneath the surface of the ocean. What you see above is just a small part. So they missed the part above, but they hit like a spur underneath, and the ship kind of bounces along, boink, 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 like this, along the side of the iceberg, and it pokes holes into the side of the Titanic. Now, originally what they thought happened was that there was a 300-foot gash in the ship, but we know now that that's not true. What happened was, because the ship had been at sea for almost 5 days at the time, in freezing temperatures, the metal on the hull became very brittle. When it hit the iceberg, the hull plates tried to bend, but they could only go so far before they cracked, and the rivets popped out, and the hull plates fell off. So basically the hull fell apart. And it happened over 5 compartments of the ship. So once the water started coming into that 4th compartment, the ship was doomed. Now remember, I said they had watertight bulkheads to keep the water from going from one place to another. That's true. But the watertight bulkheads only went up 2 or 3 decks. Once the water got above that, there was no way to save the ship. And we do have a picture of what we think was the iceberg. A couple days after this happened, a German ship was going by this iceberg, and notice there was some red paint on the bottom of the iceberg. Remember I mentioned the red anti-fouling paint they put on the bottom of the Titanic? They think that this paint came from the hull of the Titanic. So they took a picture of it, and that's the only picture we have of what we think is the iceberg the Titanic hit. So she's now starting to fill with water, and it's slopping over from one compartment to the next. Captain Smith is called to the bridge because he was in his stateroom asleep. He sends the chief engineer and Thomas Andrews, the designer, who was on the ship, down to assess the damage. They come back and they tell him the ship is going to founder, it's going to sink. And Smith says, how long do you think we have? And Andrews says, 2 to 3 hours. And this is almost midnight by this time. Smith goes down to the wireless cabin and tells Chief Wireless Operator Jack Phillips, send out a distress signal, tell them come as quickly as they can. Well, Phillips isn't sure what to do because the international distress signal has just been changed from the Morse CQD to SOS. And he says to the junior wireless operator, Harold Bride, I'm not sure who's going to recognize this, if anybody does. And Bride says, send both of them. That way you'll be sure. And then he jokingly says, it may be the only time you get to do it, to send the new one, right? So they send out this message. CQD, SOS, SOS, CQD, MGY. MGY is Titanic. We are sinking fast, passengers being put into boats, signed Titanic. Her message is picked up by many ships. The Baltic, another White Star ship, gets it. The Olympic, her sister ship does, but she's almost 500 miles away, so she can't get there. So there are many ships within distance that hear the Titanic's call, one of which is the Californian. Remember who sent the wireless message to Phillips? When Phillips got that message, he was in the process of sending personal mail to people on shore. So he told Evans aboard the Californian to just shut up and go away, basically. So Evans shut off his radio and went to bed. Californian is now just about 10 to 15 miles from the Titanic. She does not hear the SOS because Evans is their only radio operator. He's only on duty 8 hours a day, and he's in bed asleep already, so they don't get the word. You know, imagine what would have happened if she heard this. 58 miles away is the Cunard liner Carpathia. She does get the message. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, tells his crew to get everybody up, get the passengers up, we're turning around, we're heading as fast as we can to the Titanic, tell them we're coming. So their radio operator gets on the Marconi, taps out a message, we're on the way, we should be there in 5 or 6 hours. Meanwhile, the Titanic has got all the passengers up and they're getting them ready to get in the lifeboats. They're sending up white rockets. Now at sea, white rockets mean distress. If you see these, you have to come to the aid of the ship sending them up. Well, 10 miles away is the Californian. The two guys on deck who are on watch see these white rockets go up. They're not sure what they are. So they wake up Stanley Lord, who's the captain of the Californian, and they tell him what they've seen, and he says, well, you know, don't worry about it. It's probably just company signals warning people about the ice. If anything else happens, let me know. And he rolls over and goes back to sleep. Carpathia, meanwhile, is turned around, and Captain Rostron has got his doctors up and manning their stations. He's explained to the passengers what's going on. We're going to try and help Titanic. The passengers are ready to give up their cabins for any survivors, who might need them. They're starting to make food, get coffee and all this kind of stuff ready. They're opening their gangplanks. They're not even there yet, but they're getting all this stuff ready. So when they do get there, they can help people. Titanic has now started lowering their lifeboats. They lower most of them about half full. The lifeboats, depending on what they are, have a capacity of 45 to 65 people. They're loading them half full because the officers were never told that they could be loaded with full capacity. They're afraid that the davits holding the lifeboats might splinter or something. It isn't until they're halfway through doing these lifeboats that they find out, yes, you can fill them to capacity, put as many people as possible. Of course, it's women and children first. That's the rule. So what do? They go to first class, they knock on the doors, they go in, they explain the situation to the first class passengers, help them get dressed in their coats and whatnot, help them put their life jackets on, and usher them personally out to the lifeboats. Among them are John Jacob Astor and his wife Madeline. She's expecting. He gets her into a lifeboat and she wants him to come, but he says, no, I'll wait, I'll get another lifeboat, I'll see you in New York. And that's the last time she ever sees him. Isidore and Ada Strauss, who own the Abraham and Straus and Macy's department stores, they're on board in first class, and he gets her up to the boat deck, and she hears that it's women and children only, and she says, no, I'm not going to go. And her husband says, Ida, you should go, and so do all her friends. And she says, no, I've been married to my husband 57 years, where he goes, I go. And they both end up going down with the ship. William Stead, who was a newspaper editor and owner, he owned the Pall Mall Gazette in Britain. He was warned by a fortune teller, if you will, not to take any ocean voyages in the month of April. He goes down with the Titanic. As does Benjamin Guggenheim, a millionaire from Pennsylvania. He and his valet are on board with his mistress. Now his wife and kids are back in New York waiting for him, but he's on board with his mistress. He gets her into a lifeboat, and he's standing there on deck with his life jacket on, decides it's very unseemly to be seen this way in public. So he and his valet go back down, get on their tie and tails, their tuxedos and their hats, and come back up on deck and await their fate. When somebody asks him, Ben, don't you think you ought to, get in a lifeboat? And he said, no, we are dressed in our finest and we're prepared to go down like gentlemen. And they did. George and Harry Widener were buying books for Harvard University. They and their books go down with the ship. If you go to Harvard University today, the Widener Library is named after them. Also on board is Margaret Tobin Brown from Colorado. Her husband Johnny stuck it big in gold mines, and she has always gone down in history as the unsinkable Molly Brown. During her lifetime, she was never called Molly. She was known as Maggie, so it should be the unsinkable Maggie Brown. The Molly came about later on when they did a musical about her, the unsinkable Molly Brown. But anyway, she was on board, and she was put in lifeboat number 6. And she spent the night rowing around with the ladies in the lifeboat, helping to row the boats. And at one point, she saw people in the water, of course, begging for help. And she says to the gentleman who's in charge of the boat, the sailor, we should go back and pick up some more people. And he said, no, because they're going to swamp us. We got maximum now. And she looks around and there's spaces. And she says, no, there isn't. We should go back. And he says, look, lady, shut up. Molly was not the type, Maggie was not the type to take that from anybody. So she gets up and she's got an oar in her hand and she says, look, Sonny, we're going to go back and we're going to pick somebody up, or I'm going to hit you over the head with this oar. So they went back and they picked up 5 more people. 5 doesn't seem like a lot, but to those 5, it was a lifesaver, right? Sir Cosmo and Lady Lucy Duff Gordon were also aboard. He was rich. She owned a ladies' risque underwear shop in London, shall we say, kind of like an early age Victoria's Secret. She and her husband and 9 Titanic crewmen get aboard a lifeboat and they row away. So they have 11 people in a lifeboat built for 45. One of the crewmen says, we should go back and try and help people. And Lady Lucy says, oh, I don't want to, I don't feel good, and my dress might get soiled. So they don't go back. And needless to say, they got in big trouble, once they got back to shore. Archibald Butt, the military attaché to President Taft, was aboard. He goes down with the ship. But Archie Gracie, a yachtsman from Newport, is put in charge of one of the lifeboats. So he survives because he helps to row and steer one of the lifeboats. The people are up there. A lot of the women didn't want to go without their husbands, so it got to the point where they had to physically lift them up and put them in the lifeboats. And the ship is now sinking faster and faster. On deck is the ship's band under the direction of Wallace Hartley. And Captain Smith tells them, you and your men go play. Don't play any dirges or anything like that. Play light music, so people's spirits are kept up. The myth has been perpetuated that the last song they played was Nearer My God to Thee, the hymn. I got to talk to several of the survivors of the Titanic back in 1988, and to a person, and individually, without corroborating with each other, they said the last song they heard played was one called Songe d'Automne, which was a ragtime piece. They said Nearer My God to Thee was played, but that's when Captain Smith told them, Don't play that kind of stuff. Play something that's light and cheery to keep their spirits up. So now by about 2:15, April 15th, all of the lifeboats that can be launched have been launched. There's about 720 people in the boats, another 1,520 plus on board. We're not sure exactly how many people were on board Titanic. We know how many first class, we know how many second class. They did not keep track of how many third class. And remember, I told you how they went and helped, the first class? Second class, they just banged on the doors, stuck their head in the doors and said, look, the ship's in trouble, get on your life belts and whatnot, and get up to the deck. Third class, they went through and banged on the doors and said, get up to your lifeboat stations. Couple things wrong with that. First, there were no lifeboat stations in third class. By the time they got up there, most of the lifeboats were gone. And thirdly, 95% of the immigrants on Titanic were not English speaking. We always get the idea from the movies that you see that they were English, Welsh, Scottish, Irish. No. Most of them were from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or Asia. Poles, Scandinavians, Chinese, Arabic. They did not speak English. So when people just went up and down the halls yelling, get to your lifeboats, they had no idea what was going on. Once they did get the idea and got up there, most of the lifeboats were gone. And if you were from third class and you were saved, it was sheer luck of the draw. So now the Titanic's sinking very fast. The stern part of the ship raises up out of the ocean. Eventually it gets so heavy that the ship literally cracks in two and eventually sinks. The fore part of the ship first, the bow part, then the second half of the ship fills with water and it sinks. The survivors, when they got to New York, told White Star this, and nobody believed them. She was made out of steel. How could she break in half? Well, she was made out of steel, yeah. So how could a hunk of ice sink it, right? It wasn't until Dr. Ballard found the ship that they knew that this is what was happening. But why didn't they believe the survivors? Well, the majority of them are women and children. And we know that when women and children are faced with a disaster like this, they're hysterical and don't know what they're doing, right? Okay. So they're now adrift. It's 2:30, and they're adrift for about 6 hours until they see star shells on the horizon, and it's the Carpathia arriving on scene. And she starts picking up the lifeboats from the Titanic. Now when the ship sank, Second Officer Charles Lightoller was helping to put people in the boats. And it got to the point where they couldn't launch any more lifeboats, but they had these things called Engelhart collapsibles that were aboard the ship, and they were like wooden bottoms with canvas sides that were propped up with little sticks that you used to prop them up. And he was trying to get one of those into the sea so that people could use it when the ship sank around him. And the collapsible popped off the ship upside down. He's there, he's in the water, and all he has on is his pajamas, because he was off duty when this happened. So he's got his pajamas on and like a pea coat, and that's it. He ends up in the water, and he gets sucked underneath the surface by some suction from one of the intakes for the boilers. He manages, when the pressure becomes equal, he gets free, and he swims up to the surface, and his foot gets caught in some of the rigging. Again, he gets pulled down. He manages to get out of the rigging, swims back to the surface for a second time, and is almost crushed by a falling smokestack. Well, the backwash from the smokestack pushes him over to that overturned lifeboat that he had just gotten off of the ship. On top of that is several men, about 21 or 22 men, standing on top of this overturned lifeboat, leaning one way then the other to keep it from overturning. So he manages to crawl up on top of that, and that's how he becomes the highest ranking officer to survive the wreck of the Titanic. Captain Smith goes down with his ship, the first officer goes down, all the other officers, or most of them, go down except him. He's the highest ranking officer. Also on board that little collapsible is Harold Bride, the junior wireless operator. John Phillips, the senior one, does not survive. And also Charles Joguin. If you saw Titanic, there was a guy on the tail end of the ship in a white baker's uniform. That was him. He did survive the sinking. The thing with him was he helped to load the lifeboats, figured he was going to go down with the ship. So he goes down to his his cabin, and he breaks out a bottle of liquor and spends the rest of the sinking, drinking Jack Daniels or whatever he's got. Then he stumbles up to the deck just in time to end up in the water when the ship sinks. He swims over to this overturned collapsible where Bride and Lightoller is and spends the night hanging on to the side of that boat. And I think, wait a minute, he's in ice-cold freezing water all those hours. How the heck did he survive? And the kids always ask me the same thing. And I said, well, when your father wants to winterize his car, what does he do? He puts antifreeze in it, right? What is antifreeze? It's mostly alcohol. Same thing happened to him. He was so drunk and full of alcohol that he kind of insulated himself, if you can believe that. So he survives. They start picking up the lifeboats, one of which is a Engelhart collapsible that did make it make it right side up. And in that little collapsible are two little boys, Michel and Edwin Navratil. Nobody knew who they were because they were on board with their father, and he went down with the ship. They only spoke French because they were French, what they could speak, which wasn't much because they were 2 and 4. And they get back to the United States. They don't know who these kids are. They can't tell them their names. So what they do is they take a picture of them and they put them in all of the newspapers in the United States and in Europe, asking basically, anybody know who these kids are? Well, their mother in Marseille, France, sees this. She contacts White Star. They put her on the Oceanic, one of their liners, all expenses paid, of course, to go to New York, pick up her 2 kids, and bring them back home. In 1988, I met Edmund. He was an older gentleman by that time, but his brother had since passed away, but I did get to meet him and talk to him. So the last boat to be picked up by Carpathia is lifeboat number 6 with Maggie Brown and her girls in it, and they picked them up, and it's about 10 o'clock or shortly thereafter. When they get a message from the Californian, who has been about 10 to 15 miles away the whole time this is happening, saying, we just heard about the Titanic because their radio operator is now back on duty. Is there anything we can do to help? So Carpathia says, well, we've picked up all the lifeboats. Come over and search for survivors and see if you can find any more. We're turning around and heading back to New York because Carpathia was on the way to Europe. So they're just going to turn around and go back to New York. So this is a picture of the Californian from the deck of the Carpathia when she comes over. But she can't find anybody else still alive. They find some dead bodies, but no one alive. So then she heads off to Europe. By this time, the word is starting to get to Canada via Cape Race that the Titanic has sunk. But the word they get is that everybody's been saved from the Titanic. It isn't until later that they get the word, and the New York Times gets the true word first, that there's been a massive loss of life. Altogether, 705 survivors, about 1,525 victims. How did the Times get the word when nobody else did? Well, up in the Wanamaker building in New York City, they have a Marconi wireless station, which is manned 24 hours a day to listen to the ships out at sea so they know when they're going to be coming into port in New York. Well, there's a gentleman, a 21-year-old gentleman up there, who is monitoring this. He hears the report from the Carpathia, who's taken a head count. This is how many survive. If there's no more aboard the ship, there probably aren't any more. So he goes and notifies the New York Times, who breaks the news. Okay? And his name was David Sarnoff. Now that might seem familiar to you because he's the guy that later founds RCA and CBS. So now they know it's a great disaster, a great loss of life. People start coming down to the White Star Line docks and offices in New York to find out what's going on. Now remember, it was women and children first. One newlywed couple that did survive with the husband and the wife were Mr. and Mrs. George Harder, who are now aboard Carpathia. And I point them out because they're from Newport, New York, which is just north of Herkimer, down in Herkimer County. So Carpathia docks a couple days later in New York, drops anchor, and lowers the Titanic lifeboats. There's 13 of them that they have picked up. Being very frugal, White Star puts some guys to work taking the Titanic name off of the lifeboats so they can use them on other ships, but they don't want the Titanic name on there because, seamen are very superstitious. So they take a head count, they provide for the survivors, get them clothing, food, hotel accommodations, whatever they need, transportation to wherever they're going. But it's, people were wondering why was this great loss of life on a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable. And one thing I forgot to tell you was White Star Line never said the Titanic was unsinkable. It was said by a reporter from the London Times who went up to Belfast to watch the ship being constructed and said basically with all these safety features she's, quote, practically unsinkable. Okay? So that's how she got the unsinkable Titanic moniker, if you will. So how did this, why didn't they have enough lifeboats? Well, basically to save money. Somebody asked R.L. Sanderson, the White Star guy in New York, so you will put more lifeboats aboard your ships now, right? The Olympic? And he said, well, what's the chance this will ever happen to us again? It wasn't until it became mandatory, that it became the law that you have enough lifeboats for everybody on board plus 10%, that the White Star actually coughed up the money to put more lifeboats on their ships. So what they do, they get the Mackie Bennett, a cable-laying ship, to go out and search for more survivors. They're also equipped with a bunch of caskets. They go out and they do pick up some bodies off of the ocean. They had their life jackets on, and one of which is John Jacob Astor. They identify him because of a watch in his pocket with his name on it. And they bring them back to New York. Bodies kept washing ashore literally for months after this. One even showed up in the Delaware River in Philadelphia, believe it or not, many months later. If you were not John Jacob Astor, somebody who could afford to come and claim your remains, they were buried in several cemeteries in Halifax, Nova Scotia, one of which was the Fairview Cemetery. And they have what they call the Titanic plot there, and that's where all the people were buried. If they could identify them, they did. If not, they just put like Titanic passenger or unknown and with a date on it. Now, Senator William Alden Smith of the U.S. Congress had to convene an inquiry because she was, as I mentioned, an American ship. During the inquiry, they called J. Bruce Ismay and a bunch of people to come testify. And Ismay was aboard Titanic that night, and he did survive. And that was a big controversial thing. A lot of women and children, especially in third class, died. Ismay survived. How come? Somebody said he dressed like a woman to get into the lifeboat, which is not true. He did not. Charles Lightoller, who survived, said, no, that's not true. We made sure he got into a lifeboat, meaning the officers, so that someone might be able to get back and tell everybody what really happened. In charge of the British inquiry, because the American inquiry met first, because the crew was in the United States, and they decided that the fault lay with Captain Smith for not slowing down, the White Star Line for not having enough lifeboats aboard their ship, and the British Board of Trade for not requiring enough lifeboats. Of course, the British didn't like that, so they come back to England, and Lord Mersey is in charge of their inquiry, and they absolved White Star, Captain Smith, Ismay, and everybody else of any blame. It was just an act of God. Now, one of the things White Star did was once the crew got back to England, they were paid, the crew that survived, but they were only paid from the time they set sail from Southampton until 2:20 a.m. April 15th. They were not paid for the several hours they rode around in lifeboats because technically they were no longer aboard their ship, so they didn't have to be paid. The totals were ridiculous. The total passengers who went down with the ship was about 1,522 or 3 or so, the majority of which were third class, because remember they had no lifeboats and they weren't even allowed up on deck until such time as most of the lifeboats were gone. Most of the survivors were from first class and second class. Third class, forget it. They lost almost 550 people out of third class, out of the 500 and so on that were aboard the ship. So the majority came from the third class. Now there were changes that were made. It became law that you had to have more than enough lifeboats for everybody, or 10% more than the ship's capacity. So they did put extra lifeboats on board Olympic eventually, and they had enough aboard for 3,300 people, even though she only carried 3,000. There had to be a 24-hour watch on radios on all ships at sea. So you could no longer have a ship 10 miles away with its radio turned off and not know what was happening. Commercial shipping lanes were moved further south. The idea being it was warmer, the icebergs would have melted by then. The International Ice Patrol was formed, made up of the United States and Canadian Coast Guards. They're still in existence. They go out all year and keep tabs of all the icebergs up there in the North Atlantic so that the ships would not encounter icebergs anymore. They had benefits to raise money for the families of the victims. Most of the crew came from Southampton, England. So when the ship went down, many families in Southampton were left destitute with no money. They had these benefits all over, not just in England, but on this side of the Atlantic, in Europe, and everywhere else. Now Maggie Brown had a medal that she had made and struck for all the members of the crew who helped them, and like a trophy, they called it a loving cup, that was given to the crew of the Carpathia. Pretty soon there were all kinds of musical songs that came out about the wreck of the Titanic, and all kinds of books and articles and things like that. Now in 1985, Dr. Robert Ballard went out on the research ship Nore from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts, and on September 1st they found the Titanic. She was about 240 miles southeast of Cape Race. Now they'd been out several times before but couldn't find the ship because the coordinates of where she sank were different from where the wreck was located. Because of course when she sank she didn't go straight down. She went sideways, and all these different things. So they had finally found it. And they sent down a little submersible with a remote camera thing called JJ and Alvin. And they went down and they located the ship. They found that the bow of the ship hit with such force that it was plunged 60 feet into the ocean. It was in two pieces, like the survivor said, and the two pieces of the ship were about 1,500 feet apart. It was just decimated. Prior to this, about 5 years before, there was a movie out called Raise the Titanic, and they raised the ship, and they find out what happened and all this stuff. No way this ship could be raised. It was rusted, it was just totally torn apart. So of course they took a lot of pictures. The bow section, there was rust hanging off of it. They took a picture of the captain's cabin window, the gymnasium windows, the propellers, the light that was on the foremast above the crow's nest, wheel on the bridge where the wheel was where they steered the ship from, the safe from the purser's office, some stairways, the ends of some benches, a lifeboat davit. They even have a doll's head that looked really eerie because it's white and it looks almost like a human head. Some cooking pots, a champagne bottle with a cork still in it, space heaters. They even found Captain Smith's tub and his commode. There was a shoe down there, which was also kind of creepy. And when they were done exploring, because they went back several times and took pictures and all this kind of stuff, Ballard left a plaque on the stern of the Titanic from the Titanic Historical Society in commemoration of the victims, and I belong to the Historical Society. Locally, again, a guy who was a newspaper reporter named Morgan Robertson from Oswego, New York, wrote a book called Futility or the Wreck of the Titan. And in it, he had a ship called the Titan, which is like Titanic, only without the IC on it. And it sailed in April, hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic, and went down with most of the passengers and crew still aboard. Now you might think, so big deal. Everybody knew about the Titanic, right? Well, he wrote his book in 1898, 14 years before this ever happened, 9 years before they even thought of the Titanic. When people asked him, how did you know this was going to happen? He said, I saw it in a dream one night, thought it would make a cool story, and I wrote it down. So if you believe in ESP or precognition or anything like that. A little bit of trivia. The first movie about the sinking of the Titanic was made in May. It opened on May 14th. It was a silent film called Saved from the Titanic, starring Dorothy Gibson, an actress. And she was aboard Titanic that night, and that's why they got her to make it. And we have nothing left of this movie except the posters for it, so we can't even watch it. And she wore the dress in the movie that she wore in the lifeboat that night. And since then, there's been a lot of movies about Titanic. In 1953, there's one called Titanic with Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb. My favorite in 1958, A Night to Remember, with Kenneth More in it, was a British production. I mentioned Raise the Titanic in 1980. Ghostbusters 2. In 1989, there's a scene where there's two dock workers and all these ghosts are raising from the dead and haunting New York City. And they call in and said the Titanic just arrived. And it shows a picture of the Titanic with all these ghosts walking off of it. And of course, the big one, 1997, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, Titanic, which I didn't particularly like because there was a lot of stuff wrong in that movie, but I tend to be a little too critical. And they also had a musical called Titanic in 1997. I went to see it. It was okay, but it was, So what happened with Captain Smith? As far as we know, according to Lightoller, when last seen he was on the bridge of the ship and went down with the ship. Thomas Andrews, the designer, also was aboard and went down with the ship. Ismay was aboard, was put into a lifeboat, and he was saved and testified at both inquiries. But he kind of died a broken man because he never lived this down, the thing that you survived and all these women and children didn't. The White Star Line survived until just before World War II, but they lost a lot of passenger business because of this. And they eventually merged with the Cunard Line, and after World War II became known as Cunard White Star, and then eventually Cunard just dropped the White Star and it's Cunard today. They own the QE2 and a couple other ships. What about Stanley Lord, the guy on the Californian, who said, don't worry about it, People blamed him for this whole thing. He lost his job with the Leland Line, but was then hired by the Matson Line and became their commodore, their head of the line, and eventually retired. The Olympic sailed for many, many more years with only one incident. She was rammed by a British warship called the Hawk, but managed to sail back into port with no problem, was repaired, sailed for many, many more years until she was scrapped. And the woodwork from her cabins is now in a pub in London. Her sister ship Britannic was finished just in time, she was the third one, for World War I, and the Admiralty commandeered her and she became a hospital ship, was sent to the Aegean Sea and hit a German mine, went down in about half an hour, 45 minutes, with over 500 people on board, but only a few of them were not saved. There were less than 30 casualties, I think, and most of them were saved. There was a lady aboard this ship, the Britannic, her name was Violet Jessup, who survived the sinking of the Britannic. She had been aboard the Lusitania a couple of years before when she was torpedoed and sunk by the Germans, and she survived that. And she had also been a stewardess on board Titanic in 1912 and survived that. If I got on a ship that Violet was on, I'd get back off. I mean, even though she survived, I would say, no, thank you. That's pretty much it. This is it for the Titanic. Of course, they estimate the hulk of the ship might last for another 40 to 50 years, but by that time it's going to be just a pile of rust on the floor of the Atlantic, and that's all that's going to be left of her. So I thank you, and I hope maybe you learned a little something about the Titanic.